The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of the Lighting Controls Podcast. We are your hosts, Ron Kuzma and Webster Marsh, and this week we have a fantastic episode, and our guest is Patrick Treadway. But before we dive in, I just want to go through and let everyone know that this week's episode is sponsored by Toggled. Toggled is part of a global tech leader that provides software and cloud solutions for simulation, IoT, high-performance computing data analytics. They have a grassroots approach to NLC, network lighting controls, adding radio to linear lamps and expanding from there. Did you know that simply adding the Bluetooth into their lamps is a very quick way to allow you to get network controls in an existing retrofit solution? All it is a tube swap away and you're ready to rock and roll. Cybersecurity, they have all of the appropriate certificates obtained. They have an optional gateway for cloud that allows you to get into the system remotely. Did you know that they have no fees for their API integration? That's a huge add for the customer right there. Truly a customer-centric approach to network lighting controls, and they view the building holistically versus segmented, which is a big thing as we've discussed many times on the show. I just want to remind everyone that this show is also presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
It's also financially supported by NAILD, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And also, if you're listening to this on getagriponlighting.com, just a note that this is the last month you're going to be able to check us out on that website. You should check out lightingcontrolspodcast.com, which is the official website for this show. You can check it out for episodes that you haven't listened to before, or maybe some merch that you want to purchase. Or if you want to see any industry news, we have a news tracker for anything new and interesting in our industry. So here's Patrick. Welcome to the Lighting Controls Podcast. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us here today. Do you mind just giving us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Webster and Ron. I appreciate that very much. As introduced, Pat Treadway, and I'm a consultant in the lighting industry. I've been working this consultancy now for a couple of years. I think starting that out in the pandemic was kind of an interesting step, but I kind of figured, no better time to catch up with the crowd and be competitive when everybody else was slowed down was kind of my thinking back then. I come to lighting actually with maybe a little bit of an unusual background in the sense it's very, very diverse. I spent a lot of years in architecture and structural steel early on, and doing the steel, putting up the buildings, part of things. Spent a number of years in the recreational vehicle industry as well. So building those big giant Class A motorhomes that you see going down the road and doing the chassis and interiors and floor plans was part of the role there. As I kind of finished my design education, I have a background in industrial design, and moved through those roles. I began to migrate over into lighting through the decorative side. So a company called Minka Lighting, quite a large manufacturer on the decorative side with the whole showroom experience. Very interesting, lots of branding, lots of style and design work there. And then migrated into the commercial lighting side through MaxLight, and subsequently on through Energetic and Sloan LED and a number of companies. So it kind of has given me an opportunity to really bring to bear that design mindset, if you will, where we're looking at marrying a lot of disparate parts of any process or project and bring them in a new and unique way to answer the questions and the problems there. But at the same time, do it in a way that allows me to bring in the reflection of those different industries. So whether you're doing engineer to build, build inventory, whether you're looking at code and compliance, these are all things that every various industry has their aspects of, but how they approach them is slightly different. So I like to try to bring those things into play for my customers when they're asking for help and solutions on their side. So it's kind of been a nice, fun ride in that respect to bring all those things to bear at the same time.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, it's interesting, and your role right now, I almost am tempted to call you an integrations designer, because you're just kind of this glue between various unrelated components, and you're facilitating a way for them to work together. And so it's really interesting to hear where you started from, because without that experience, I wonder if you would be able to kind of take these unrelated components and piece them together nowadays.
I think there's a fluency, kind of a muscle memory that you start to draw on
Mm,
as you start to engage and bring those past experiences to bear. And kind of one analogy, for example, when we would do structural steel and we would lay out a project and you get it to the job site, and from the sidewalk it looks like mass confusion laying on the ground. um, but it's really a very carefully orchestrated lay down of the components so that when you come in with the crane, you're picking them up in sequence in the most
mhm.
expeditious manner as possible. So you can bring that kind of relationship to bear when you start looking at, okay, how do you want to set up an assembly line? How do you want to go about structuring the process by which you do something? And so there's really some neat tie-ins when you can bring those things to the plate.
Yeah, no, I mean so I mean, taking that model that you just talked about, actually, and applying it to where we're at with lighting controls, I wouldn't necessarily say we're quite there where it's everything's meticulously laid out and then just kind of cemented in. It's more of that we're kind of exploring the best approach to these things as we're installing them.
Yeah, I would very much agree with you on that. One of the experiences I relate to, as a young designer, you get introduced to new technologies as you move through your career. And I can remember one particular episode, and I'll have to do a little confession here, and tattle on myself, but um, it's just fascinating. And the example was some laser cutting, and it was when lasers were getting very popular and first coming out to do mass sheet cutting of metals. And so you're like, oh, great, I'm going to start, what can I do this? What can I do this? And you start to approach everything from that perspective. Now, at the end of the day, you step back and look at what you've created and you go, well, that could have been done about two or three other ways, cheaper, faster, and less complicated than what you did. Yes, you achieve that, but
Mm,
it's, kind of goes back to, I'm going to, approach everything with a hammer because I got a hammer. Um,
right.
so to some degree, I think the industry is migrating out of that phase where there's a lot of different ways to connect. There's a lot of different ways to communicate. Um, it's becoming more and more refined as to what works best in an application or in a specific instance, and not try to make everything fit or try to do everything with the same tool as that example kind of laid out.
Sure. So I mean, taking your business model and applying it almost sounds like it's that you want to identify the best formats, the best workflows, essentially, to achieve efficiency within whatever it is that you're synthesizing.
Well, it can be in a process context, as you're describing, where you're helping somebody uh, overcome maybe a traditional practice and way of doing things,
Mhm.
and identifying those and kind of getting them to re-tribalize, then re-commercialize and institute that, so that it becomes now the new normal behavior. Um, on a technical level or on a communications level, what you do find is that your challenge is always entrenchment and investment. So when you have a company that has a deep investment in tooling, a deep investment in technical expertise, they're very loath to migrate to something else because that comes at a cost. So that becomes a very big challenge if you approached with a client who says, well, I want to get out of Bluetooth and go to Wi-Fi or vice versa. Well, now you've got an issue with your accumulated tribal knowledge within your engineering ranks, deep expertise in one area, and now you're going to move them over and make them all feel very inefficient, less experienced, and less competent in doing this new thing. And so migrating those dips with them and trying to keep focused on the value is part of the role you have, but working through that ahead
that's
of
a
time
really
before
good
you
point.
implement is a big deal.
That's a really good point, though, that a lot of people might not realize when they go to their manufacturer's reps or directly to the manufacturer and say, hey, why don't you do X? You know, you're not talking about just flipping a switch and being able to change everything. You're talking about from the ground up, systematically, the whole structure of the business needs to be altered to accommodate that. So say, for instance, there's a lighting controls manufacturer out there that uses Bluetooth or Wi-Fi and wants to switch to a different protocol. You're not just talking about the parts and pieces inside of the devices. You're talking about training the labor and getting the expertise up to par so that they can compete with other manufacturers that are already doing that.
Yeah, it's one of the interesting dynamics within the lighting and controls manufacturing systems themselves. When you start reaching back into those and you're trying to, from a product management standpoint, I'm looking to do something that meets my end users' needs. And so I should have a good product definition that tells me in my organization where we're headed. Now I've got to go pull those resources forward that pair up to that successfully. What you then start with is, okay, who's the closest to doing what we're envisioning, and maybe can I get them incrementally up to that speed, or is this a clean sheet of paper where there really is nobody making what I want to make, and now you've got to get somebody to engage you and saying, okay, I'm going to pull off very expensive committed resources to come over on something that's very unknown. So there's a resistance, there's a tension in the system that does not allow you to necessarily do that overnight. I mean, we've all kind of walked into those situations where we go, wow, this is just like better than cheese, this is just the greatest thing. But it becomes entwined with those other hard realities, as you're mentioning, those hard assets, the training, the people resources. Very, very difficult to replace those skill sets on an equivalent basis in real time. It just doesn't happen as quickly as we might like to.
I mean, from looking at it this way, it almost sounds like it's easier for a manufacturer to start from the ground up if they want to take a complete 180 than to have to restructure everything.
That often can be the easier thing. I mean, we've all had experiences with remodel versus new construction. You can go in and repaint your bathroom and you wonder why it took you 15 hours,
Right.
in such a small space, but it still has, 16 corners and 6 walls, and just like a living room. So it doesn't always equate the trouble you're going to run into. The idea of implementing from scratch, from new, in a lot of ways clears old barriers, but now you do still get faced with that issue of, okay, building up the talent, building up the resources. I have to build up compliance files. I have to build up test equipment to now go with the new thing too. And so there's a headwind from another direction in that respect. So the sum total that you get faced with is, okay, what's our best way of meeting the customer objective? What's going to be our minimum viable product per se? And ideally kick it over a little bit closer to our desired product. and at the same time leverage what's there, because the clock's always ticking in the background.
Sure.
It's just, we don't have that endless time that we'd all like to have
Well,
when we develop something.
so I mean, I guess with that sort of, I guess the term would be shifting the goalpost in a way to try to get people to adopt your product, but over time you're changing what that product is, would explain why a lot of people are experiencing whiplash from the industry when everything's changing all the time. One manufacturer will provide a product this year, but next year that product's antiquated and they have a new product out.
The technology change rates are just dizzying. They can just be daunting. If you think back 10, 15 years ago, which seems like forever in today's pace of speed, but a lamp was a lamp was a lamp was a lamp, and
Right.
you could put it on a shelf for 10 years and come back and pull it off and still use it. Now you're faced with something goes on the shelf for 6 months. The question is it still viable? Is it still going to be, yes, it'll be usable, but if it's no longer going to interface, it's not dimming now, it was on off. You've just obsoleted wholesale things all at a similar time. So it could be very difficult from that perspective to try to migrate product evolution at the same time making sure you're being expeditious on your inventory and your current assets.
Yeah, and this is something that we see all the time recently, right? And not recently, but we've been talking about it for a while, that it's very common now, and it's unfortunate that with a lot of LED lamps, right? There's a lot of times where, not even just in LED lamps, but even just ballasts and fixtures, where manufacturers, their cut sheets would say the exact same thing, but 3 months later, 6 months later, they weren't able to even just get the same components. So forget a redesign of, right, we're trying to change technology. In some cases now they can't even get the same chipsets anymore, and they can't get the same ballasts, and now the fixture or the lamp doesn't perform to what the customer is used to and expecting based on what they have an entire building full of. And the manufacturer doesn't even, there's no documentation that this change has happened, and there's no sort of real answer, because a lot of times it's, well, we can't get that chip anymore and this is what it is now. And the customers are sort of left in this weird situation sometimes, where you're trying to match existing equipment and it's just not the same as it used to be.
Yeah, and it gets even more fluid and more dynamic than that when you start to pull in aspects of quality of light and the quality of the environment that you're trying to create with the controls, because you may be pulling in things such as CRI and CCT. It's difficult enough oftentimes to simply get a one-for-one replacement at the same output,
Right.
let alone all the other aspects. And now you've got a situation where I've got a large room, and we've all seen this, in the early days of LED and back in fluorescent days, blue, green, red, green, going down the ceiling because things don't match.
Right.
And I can remember the old phrase, and Lord, I hate saying I'm old enough to remember old phrases. But the computers enable you to make more mistakes faster. So to tie that in, the digitization of controls and lighting allows us to proliferate so much faster, but at the same time, you can proliferate a mistake that much faster as well. Is the point I'm trying to drive at there. So the commonality, I think, in a lot of ways, is the industry as a whole wanting to drive towards definitions and metrics that can establish better foundations for how a space is going to be interoperated by and participated by its inhabitants. Because that's the end game, is I've got a space that functions well for my inhabitants and enhances what they're doing. So what that definition is for today, I don't think really exists. I think we're seeing some metrics start to come into the market that point us closer to that solution. But that definition is going to drive us back all the way to what we were describing earlier in manufacturing and that supply chain. Uh, to reset the beginning stages. One of the very big challenges I went through with a product portfolio at one point was that um, you're working with very different factories and different applications. Okay, so each one of them has their particular supply chain that they like to use and draw their components from. So factory A may not have ready access to a driver that has 12-volt aux available. The next factory does. So now when I get these things all under my roof and I've got the sales team saying, we've got to have a controls option for everything. Well, that's great, but now I got to burden this product with X dollars more to put that DC power in there and not this one. Well, now I've got pricing that's just totally out of whack across my portfolio. And so now you start to getting into price subsidies and cost subsidies and things like that to make things work out transparent to the end user. It's not an easy or happy situation for anybody, let alone service, which has to get the call on the backside. My fixture's out, and you've probably experienced this. The very kind person on the other end says, well, can you send me a picture of what you're holding? Do we ever want to be in that role where I have to say, oh, this is what I have. What do I do?
Right.
Because that's a really unfair field to leave our customers on, in my estimation. It really shouldn't be an acceptable norm.
No, I agree. And I think, we do a disservice to a lot of occupants and owners in our industry because of the fact that, there's so much unknown and so much that, as you've said, gets proliferated as a mistake and just is ubiquitous. And then suddenly you have to do a clean sweep recall to basically get all the products back and give the owner what they actually expected in the first place. But then there's a whole chain of events that needs to happen there where you need to get technicians or electricians to reinstall stuff. And, there's just this whole host of reasons why it's better to just have it done correctly the first time. But at the same time, broken parts happen, but still
Right.
the experience the owner's going to have, even if the whole project, you have, thousands of fixtures, one goes bad, they're going to be left with a sour taste in their mouth because of that customer service experience that they had.
Absolutely. When you approach things with an industrial design type mindset, um, there's a phrase, when you start at the beginning, consider the end. And that's a great reference point that um, whether you're manufacturing luminaires or whether you're manufacturing controls or a hybrid of the two, whether that's done totally offshore or whether you're doing some onshoring and post assembly here, at the end of the day, we still need to come into that with the notion that somebody at some point has to fix it, has to update it, has to manage that asset once it's kicked over the curb and the PO is paid. Um, that's a real necessary need to have the industry listening to the product input side of things, because what you want to be doing is you want to be sharing with that supply chain, these are the key features that I must have from my customer, these are key features I must have from my industry. And they will listen. It does work through the chain. And a great example is Design Lights Consortium. In my first early years in the lighting industry, DLC had been on the uptick, gotten their prominence. There was very much, you will go make sure we comply with DLC from senior management, so that we can capitalize these rebates. So it was all monetized, and it was predictably, going to drive a behavior from our side. And what you then witnessed over time within the supply chain is I could engage 10 companies as a source of supply, and 40% of them didn't even know what DLC was. They barely understood what UL or Intertech was, and a number of them even thought that that was a government agency. So from their perspective and their education of what was happening beyond their doors, was very subject to local interpretation on their side. So what you witness was over time, as you introduce these people and you educate them, we need DLC. Here's what DLC is. Here's what the qualification is. Here's what the standard is. They now begin to bake that into their planning and their product evolution. So what they were bringing to bear as a portfolio and saying, okay, here's my offering this year. Can you utilize this? Now those things were evident. Now those things were in place. So as a poster child for that kind of behavioral adjustment, I think it lets us know that we can have meaningful impact, but we have to now speak in a much more unified voice than previously. So often we were speaking just in lighting terms because all I was really worried about was getting lumens on the surface for my applications engineer, and my sales guys wanted to know the efficacy so they could get the ROI and get the rebate. That's not a big enough conversation, not big enough perspective of the new demands, I think. We're really, lighting is part of a much larger digital infrastructure. Controls are a part of that. And now we have got to speak in a voice that says, hey, together, this is what really is needed to affect buildings, what's needed to affect environments in the most meaningful way, and set some of those ground rules.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it, that lighting is really a part of a holistic system, because I think the way that things, at least in North America, are specified and installed are very siloed. You have lighting and controls typically dealt with by one person and in a vacuum almost, and then the mechanical divisions, the fire protection divisions, the plumbing divisions, they kind of operate in their own territory. And so trying to get people to think of lighting as more of a bigger piece or a piece to a bigger puzzle, I think is one of the challenges that we have right now. And I think networked lighting controls is kind of the glue that's holding it to everything else right now. And fortunately, there are conversations now being had saying, oh wait, we're not just alone. We're not just trying to hit a target foot candle on a task surface. We're trying to integrate with AV. We're trying to switch VAV boxes or work with a building automation system. And so, that takes a very different perspective than what the traditional perspective with lighting was.
Yeah, it really is. And you see some evidence of the mindset in some of the larger tier one companies, where they're starting to take that perspective that I've got to look at the full portfolio and treat it all together when I go out to deal with buildings and projects, and not just as a standalone device. And I think that kind of points to a positive direction that's going to occur. Now, the challenge is that's great. That's going to address the 20% at the top, but there's still a lot of smaller projects, small buildings, small programs that aren't approaching it that way. So how do we get them to take on that extra load? Because when you kind of look at the dynamic of it, it's been a challenge. It's less so now to get a luminaire made to a decent set of specifications, so that we have the long lifetime, we have long life drivers, we have decent life on our LEDs and those things. But now I've got to educate everybody on what are the key pieces about making two devices communicate well. And that's just a simple part of it, because when you're doing a control design, a site design, you're not just dealing with can the two devices talk to each other. You're dealing with what the devices can detect. So I liken it in my brain to look up and look down. My fixtures need to be looking down and doing the the capture the reaction to the space that they're dealing with, but then they need to look up and be able to see their peers successfully and have a decent overlay and connect. So you're going to ask somebody who's been dealing with foot candles and efficacy to now talk about antennas and detection. So, and that's just on the product engineering, product management side. Now you want to move that out into the sales environment, and how do I convey that value? Do I know enough about what the value is to now sell the value? Becomes a big challenge.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're starting to see some of the larger companies like heading, right? Like you'd mentioned. And it's not just the manufacturers. This also comes back down to the controls designers too, right? Because in order to sort of really achieve this holistic building control, we need to be looking at the larger picture. So we need the sensors to communicate with HVAC. We need them to communicate with plug loads, right? And a lot of these things we can already do, but we need the controls designers to be able to look at that and look at the holistic building and say, okay, as a sale, right, this is where sales really steps in, and they need to understand the product, and they need to understand the solutions, and they need to help drive that to the client and say, here's how we can help you be more efficient. Here's how we can give you more data through these sensors using this open source protocol and this and that. We're able to feed data to this. We're able to give you this. We can trigger this. All right. And that's where we need to start seeing that go. So it comes from the manufacturing side, because they need to provide devices that will give that feedback to third parties. It also comes down to the controls designers and the sales guys to really start to push this and drive it home to start to make an impact. Because if lighting controls don't start to make this push, somebody else is going to, and it's going to happen. It's a matter of who wants to sort of take the ball and run with it, is really the way I see it.
Yeah, I agree with your statement, Ron, because one of the very interesting dynamics over the last half dozen years was going to different events and different committee work and shows, and when you sit and you start to look at who's in the audience with you. So these are your peers, this is your industry peers, and you go, oh, well, that's a data company. Oh, well, wait a minute, that's telecommunications. What are they doing at a lighting show? And the truth is that what you have people doing the natural business migration, which is seeking revenue through opportunity. And so where you can add layers to your bottom line by leveraging what you are capable of. It's kind of what we were talking about earlier in manufacturing. It's a similar analogy in business. Well, then it makes some sense to go look and see if there's some green field we can go occupy over there. And it's been kind of fascinating to watch these companies walk into the space and either through organic internal growth, strap on the lighting component, strap on the controls piece, or acquire and become a little bit more unified in their initiative. But nonetheless, they're coming in with an expertise. And when you get a company that has a core skill set in data harvesting, data mining, all they really want to know is, man, I want to get the data from the detection into what I can really make money at. Then they're going to take off with it, and they're going to go. So they don't worry so much about whether they really know it or don't know it. They'll get the skills to do it. They recognize the inherent value is there. So it becomes an interesting stage to watch, where you're going to look at the deck chairs get reshuffled. If you got a company that's been inherently lighting, are they going to now go and bring in the sensing capability, because they recognize that's a key piece to then getting them to being able to leverage the lighting sales. And the converse happens with controls companies. We need to have light because that's going to occupy the space. Now I can come in behind it and utilize the space and take advantage of it. So there's been some companies that have done amazingly well at that. And I think, again, that we have some great breadcrumbs and poster children across the industry. And I look to see that just continuing to move forward. It'd be nice at a faster pace, but it is occurring, I think.
Well, and so I'm curious, if you were given just sort of an unlimited grant to start a new company and enter the lighting controls market right now, and with the expectation that in 5 years you're going to get your return on investment, things are going to be moving along smoothly, like what would be your first few steps in that process?
Oh, wow. What a great question. Boy, let me know who's writing the check. I'll go for that today. I think what you want to do in those initial steps, I'll call it, is you want to look for some natural synergies, and that is where are the needs at. If I'm looking at, I'll just spitball this.
Sure.
You're looking, say, like a lighting at a truck stop. Okay. And we've all been to those off the interstate, the massive, there's hundreds of diesels over there, and there's cars flying through here, and I can get a burger, I can get chicken, I can get a hat, and I can get moccasins.
Yeah.
But what you step back and kind of observe is that I have people interacting with diverse spaces, and they're very closely co-located. Okay. So when I have that kind of dynamic, what that tells me is I have the ability to leverage a backbone structure, which lighting does that because it's power. Power is what inherently ties it together. Now, can I improve their experience by the digitization of that space, and how can I make those improvements? But then to the facility owners and operators, how do I drive back value to them? And the obvious things are energy savings and things like that. But when we start to look at other issues, such as, do I have a diesel truck in every truck bay overnight paying to park there overnight? Is that, do I get 8 hours out of that slot, 7 hours? Do I get 15 hours? How soon can I get the next truck in there? And you only do that by being able to reach beyond your site and let people know, hey, I got an open spot. So whether it's electric vehicles wanting to pull in and recharge, well, if you go across the Mojave Desert in California, you're headed to Las Vegas, you'll run into this. There's sites with 40 EV chargers. Wow. And you go through there any given time of day, there's nobody there.
Huh.
So the question becomes, are we broadcasting and letting people know we have resources they can pull into now and take advantage of, and then depart? Well, now I've made that site inherently more profitable in that fashion. So that's the first step I would take. I would look for those areas that produce a maximum synergy, and that would become my entry to that business. Because once you know how you can make a tight site interop, now you can distribute those sites, and now you're simply just leveraging distance as opposed to all of the other subsystem internets like you have to do, or knitting that you have to do, because you've got sales, you have power and energy, you have HVAC, you have traffic. You want to knit those things together successfully before you then begin to leverage too far.
Well, that's really interesting to hear, because I feel as though, again, being so siloed in our industry, a lot of people will just look for gross numbers or gross square footage and target those projects instead of thinking about, how complex and tightly knit is the site. A school building has a lot of fixtures, but there's not a lot of intricacy to it. It's just, if it's a public school, maybe they just want to replace the fixtures one to one. They don't need a specialty lighting design, but they need to comply with energy code. Whereas with your truck stop example, you do have a lot of different elements being involved there in such a small footprint. It may not be a gross number of light fixtures that you're selling, but what you're selling in the end is a gross amount of service to that.
Mhm.
And ultimately, if it's an owner that owns multiple truck stops, then hopefully they will look at this one truck stop that you improved and they'll go, oh, we need to do this across the board.
Yeah, that's the key selling point is showing that value. The truck stop analogy is interesting because it represents a diversity of users and a diversity of
Mhm.
data. Um, to your example about schools, the data is a bit more vanilla in the sense that
Mm.
the uses have a lot of typical commonality to them. Um, but it does start to ask the other question that is that all the space can be utilized for? Are there other
Mm.
functions for it? When we look at the high expense, and we've all run through this the last couple of years with real estate as an example,
Mhm.
uh, that starts to ask yourself as a builder, architect, or owner, what can I do to leverage this and maximize my return? So it's increase the utilization of the parties that are there, or bring in additional parties that are not yet there. And so that can become a way to now explain, here's the value of monetizing to you as a building owner, builder, or property manager. Let's increase your utilization rates because I can identify when you've got massive amounts of open time.
Mhm.
Let's improve your cost structure because I've identified when you're heating an empty stairwell on a Saturday,
Right.
as an example. Um, and there's just amazing amounts of energy that can come into play. And I was listening to a conversation earlier where they talked about just pennies on total fuel cost to heat a building added up to
Mhm.
tens of thousands of dollars a month. So
Right.
if you've now got 120, 130, $50,000 additional revenue that you can save, you can look at putting some of that in the first year and then recap it in years 2 and 3.
Mhm.
But it's a tougher sell. It's a difficult thing, and
Right.
you asked the question a little bit earlier, why not? And I think it's because uh, life itself and business speed itself is very difficult to carve out enough time to consider intricacies, consider some of the subtleties that really have to be pondered on, and bring that to bear in a timely manner because now you need to move on to the next business issue and the next business issue. And you can't
Right.
devote the time and resources to it. So it does come down to folks like yourselves and myself to do some of that thinking ahead of time for them, and then let's propose it and let's move toward that goal.
Right. And so, I mean, when it comes to interacting with facilities managers, owners, there really is sort of this challenge of cold calling them, getting them to hear you out and consider it. So, I think there is sort of a lot of resistance to widespread adoption when it comes to like building management or building automation systems, but also there's a lot of stigma with these systems as well. A lot of people
Mm.
hear automation or these integrated systems and they go, "Oh, well, I heard so and so had a real bad result from that or they've had personal poor experiences with lighting controls and they're kind of turned off already to it."
Yeah, I can recall listening to folks over in the Energy Star program a number of years back, lamenting some of the errors that they experienced in moving through the implementation of CFLs and starting to phase out fluorescence. Even though they brought in fluorescence as a reaction to HID and some of the other sources, and there was many stories about how color flicker noise just impacted their users horribly. On a personal level, I had a cousin send me a picture one day, and it was a CF bulb that had totally flamed out. And she just goes, "Is this normal?" And so it was basically the ballast just burned through the base of the bulb. It was not good quality. It was bought at a discount. So when we moved into solid state lighting implementation, a lot of the folks that are dealing with code and compliance and energy savings management were very, very quick and very hard fast about saying, let's not revisit those sins again. Let's try to do this a little bit better. And I think to a large degree, it has been better. So the question becomes, have we learned that lesson when it comes to implementing lighting controls? And I myself have heard some of those same scenarios. Now, everybody's sensitivity comes into play, where if I have one problem on a commissioning and implementation, is that a bad implementation? Well, not necessarily. There's always going to be the random fixture you can't find. Where is that thing? I can't. It's not here. It's not here. But when you hear the stories about taking 5, 6, 7 days of downtime, they can't have the subs working. They've got to clear it out in order to go solve this thing. That tells you that there's inherently a problem with the approach, and we need to really revisit that. I don't think technically it should be a problem that when you energize a bay and energize a circuit and everything comes on that circuit, those sensors should be able to self-identify and self-relate in a way that you can harvest them up in mass and not have to go point by point by point by point. I think that's a real big improvement that could be made. If I just install and energize it, they should be able to tell me they're there, not me ask the question, are you there? It's kind of the big challenge.
Yeah, and so I mean, a lot that kind of gets along the lines of where lighting controls handshakes happen, where a lighting control system will talk to a building management system, but they aren't actually acting as a BACnet client. They're just acting as a BACnet server, and they're just waiting for inquiry. They're basically just on standby, and then when a BACnet query comes in, it'll send back status information, but it's not actively reaching out to the BACnet system saying, hey, by the way, I'm here. Here's all the data you need.
Yeah, and I think that points at some of the silo questions you were mentioning, and in working in evolving the industry to where on a product level and on a system level HVAC, can we get those to talk together better? Can there be more natural integrations? We hear and see companies like Niagara Platform doing some of that cross-talking more intuitively. There's been improvements in Bluetooth, low energy, where they've got the qualified mesh coming along. You have Dolly 4. Some of these things are starting to point at more commonality on the app levels to where things are cross-talking a little bit more fluidly. And I think that's just that next step of evolution. We have to get to the point where the devices and the means by which they talk and interrelate are very fluid and established. I know there's still an awful lot of resistance to Zaga, which in a lot of ways is just nothing but physical interface. So here we can't quite even get over the physical of, these three this wide, this high fit together. And now we want to talk about software trying to cooperate. It's still a challenge. But I think to kind of pull this back around, when we let the supply chain know that things have to be sustainable, I better be able to unplug and plug in a repair in minutes and seconds and hold the integrity of the electrical circuit, hold the integrity of the power. I need to be able to add and update controls in a seamless manner. We're now going to drive to common language. We're going to drive to over-the-air updates where we stop violating the ceiling to go do a retrofit. That just defies common sense when we know that we have a solution in hand. It's just getting the whole chain to start to play into that and to feed us up properly those pieces and components that are ready for that integration.
So, I mean, ultimately, it sounds like your ideal for lighting controls is getting to a completely wireless, holistic approach where data analytics are very easy to accomplish. And, under an ideal circumstance, you said violating the ceiling. I'm guessing you're saying you don't want to be able to, you don't need to cut a hole in the ceiling or open up a tile to to get your lighting control system to function. You just ideally would be able to stick a sensor right on the ceiling and then you're done. And it will self-identify, self-program. And that way it's almost plug and play without the plug.
Yeah, it needs to be that ubiquitous. The reality of business is that if I build my profit into how many times I have to touch something, how many times I have to move it, how many times I have to wrap it, how many times I have to do anything. It's all got an expense tied to it. And the same thing with contracting. When you're out in the field, and I love watching the guys work. It just on a human factors level, it's just fascinating to me to lay out the project, lay out their luminaires, lay out where they're going to cable, lay out where they're going to wire, and then they run the table, zip, 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 all the way down. If they have to go back and interrupt the flow, if they have to go back into that finished work, it's a loss. Every single moment's a loss. Every truck roll, every time I got to go back in that room, it's a loss. If we can capture that urgency to avoid that and design it in a best circumstance world, that I think that's going to be ideal. But I think there's very little barrier anymore, and there's very little rationale anymore that says we can't be ubiquitous to that level. If our drivers can have near field programming in them, you're already you're already in a radio that far away. Let's get the radio stretched out here a bit, and away we go.
I think though part of the challenge there is the siloing of pricing, because while you may not see overall, the project may have a cost reduction by doing that. The cost of the luminaire package or the lighting control package is going to go up to provide that additional level. And so what people see is they see lighting controls 100K. Oh, well, that's too much. We need to reduce that. But they don't see lighting controls installation 50K. Now, when you drop that 100K to a 50K, the installation goes to 200K. There's not a equitable ratio when you're talking about it, but the unfortunate reality is that you don't actually see that price. You don't see the true price tag of the whole project right in the same, bill of materials.
Yeah, and I would encourage the sales transaction to look at involving more than just the owner or the CFO. Because what happens is typically project responsibility filters down within the organization. That's a very natural thing to do. It's the right thing to do. But at the same time, somebody who's tasked with minding those costs can be making a very short-term reaction analysis to improving the company's bottom line. For all the right reasons, the wrong thing occurs. And that is the compromise of the end game, which is having the ideal lighting system doing the right thing and bringing down the overall cost and raising the inherent value of the facility. So I think that's part of the evolution of the sales process, where we have got to start to engage deeper through the organization, is let the goals and criteria for the different pieces of the program be known. I know it's almost counterintuitive for contractors to divulge line item costs, because you may be subsidizing or push things around based on labor and material cost and availability. So you want to keep, well, here's the bottom line. This is what the whole thing's going to cost you. No problem. Well, with a lack of view, then you're going to leave it to your customer's imagination as to where he's getting dinged the hardest and where he's not. And nobody wants to give away the farm. We agree with that. But maybe there's a need for a little more transparency at a different level and drive it down through the organization just a bit below that, so that the people at the operational level who are dealing with the projects now have an idea of the real value of different pieces of this, and they may make a little bit different trade-off or different ask at the time when it comes up. So
Well, and
defining
also
the
this could be benefited from a commissioning agent too, who's kind of viewing the project holistically and can pick up on, oh, you're VEing your lighting control system, but you do realize in that move you're gonna shoot your labor cost up. So it might not just have to be going through to a lower rank in the company. It could just be that the owner hires a commissioning agent to facilitate that conversation a little bit more. But at the same time, if you don't have a commissioning agent, you can't afford a commissioning agent, you're already VEing your lighting control package. To your point, maybe it is better to just kind of get more input from the company.
I think in either circumstance, the bringing parties to the table when you get to the beginning of the project, and every phase you have different starting points of that particular milestone going forward. So once you get to the point where we now have a defined package and we have a defined floor plan, there's an opportunity for communication there about here's what we're proposing and why, and what it drives to these different outcomes. Now everybody becomes ideally a little bit more sensitive to that and will make some different trade-offs. But that also means who's sitting at the table when you have that conversation. Has a commissioning agency been established yet? That's a big question. Maybe the contractor and electrician have enough experience, they feel they can handle it on their own and have elected to go that way. And for all intents and purposes, they do. But again, a commission agent may bring a lot more different depth of perspective to making those VE trade-offs that could occur in the field. So there's a lot of nuances to it. It's not an easy thing, which we all know. At the same time, I think across the board, having a better visibility that my demands up front and have to arrive in the product, that product has to arrive in the field in a certain condition and format that now facilitates the rest of the interaction and getting it into a functional level. It's a big ask.
For sure. Well, we're almost out of time here, but I just want to kind of take what we've talked about here and distill it as best as I can. I think what you bring to the industry is a much needed perspective and much needed service. I almost want to change what I said. It almost feels like you're an integrations commissioner, where you're basically looking at how to streamline and synthesize things and follow through from beginning to end to make sure that the result is an improvement on the whoever your client is. And what's refreshing to hear from you is all of these unknown, or at least lesser known, pieces of information when it comes to choices from a manufacturer's perspective when it comes to lighting controls specifically, because lighting controls manufacturers kind of have a smoke screen of information that allows them to stay competitive, but at the same time it interferes with our ability to provide quality lighting controls on projects. And so what you're trying to say is, a greater level of transparency is going to improve that, but also just identifying, where the lighting controls have the maximum benefit. A lot of people see large scale projects as the best place to target for sales, but it sounds like actually where the best place to do sales for lighting controls is where there's a highest amount of synthesis integration or coordination, rather than just sheer scale of project size. And so to approach our lighting, the industry as a whole, it almost sounds like we need to alter our focus a little bit, because again, we're just so regimented and siloed in our own territory, and we need to start expanding out and thinking holistically about the project, rather than just, this is my territory of scope and that's it.
Yeah, I think you've summed it up very, very, very well. There's broad opportunity when you step back and look at it from a higher level and across a wider spectrum. It doesn't always mean that you're going to go chase rabbits down a hole or spend unnecessary time, but what it does allow you is an examination of maybe what are the better trade-offs, what can I leverage additionally from my end user or the
Mhm.
potential end user of anything in a more meaningful way. I think that's one of the key things is to just simply be able to drive to those levels and realize the more I can bring value to what the ultimate end is, I'm going to increase my share of the pie.
Mhm.
We've got to migrate up away from pennies on the dollar commodity sale at one end of the spectrum, because once it's commoditized, there's no margin revenue, and the nice parts of those pie all happen when you're up providing the most value. And that's going to be buildings that hold their value, stay occupied, have a demand to
Hmm.
get in there, be occupied, and then can be serviceable for long periods of time and keep up with technology as it evolves. Those are the things that are going to be saying, that's the company I want to do this for me.
Yeah, and just quickly, really, if you really just break it down into one big bubble, the value and the money is in the data, right? But it's not just in the data, it's how we then interpret that data and provide it to the customer, right? So the real win here isn't as much the data. We all know the sensors and the fixtures and everything else is capable of providing it. It's how we then wrap it up and provide it to them in a nice, in an easy to read dashboard or platform that allows them to make those decisions and those choices, that allows them to keep their tenants in the building. How do they get more customers in? How do I do this? How do I do that? Right? That's where that is how do we give them that data in an easy to read platform?
Excellent summary. I think that hits the nail right on the head. The data is the key. It's the end game. It's where all things are being driven to. And at the end of the day, we want them to be able to utilize data in a fluid, non-technical, everyday street conversant level. We don't want to convert everybody to be in IT. We don't want everybody to have to be a
Right.
software analyst. That's not the practical level for it. They need to simply be able to understand, this is what my space is giving me, and this is what I need to do to my space, and doing it in a vernacular that allows them to manage it very intuitively and very simply. Now you have no barriers. There's no barriers to using and implementing, because now you're actually going to create demand pull.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. You bring a really refreshing perspective to our industry, and I hope to speak with you again on this podcast.
Well, great. And thanks for having me. And I appreciate the dialogue and have enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Well, what a great conversation with Patrick. Just so you know, this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA, and it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And Ron just wanted to thank our sponsor and talk a little bit more about them. Ron?
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone that this week's episode is being sponsored by Toggled. And Toggled is a global tech leader that provides software and cloud solutions for IoT, high performance computing, data analytics, and AI. They have a grassroots approach to NLC, network lighting controls, and they added Bluetooth into their linear lamps. That means you are just a tube swap away from a direct wire retrofit and adding network lighting controls to your building. Through their cloud solution, they can offer you all the access that you need. They have no fees for their API integration, and they value holistic building control versus segmented. So they really want to tie everything in and bring everything back to one interface and allow you to bring it all back to one holistic system. And that's something that we really appreciate here.
So check it out, toggled.com. Also, some things that we talked about on this podcast today that's worth mentioning. Toggled provides a BACnet client, so they're not just a server. They can actually provide the full BACnet service to any systems that you need building automation or building management for. And additionally, with the direct installation fluorescent tube replacements, you do not need to violate the ceiling to be able to install a toggled system. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Patrick, for a great conversation.